subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution.
So he was acquitted on
the House of Representatives.
Resolution 1.
Impeachment inquiry.
He was acquitted.
Focused on President Trump's
they kicked it out.
solicitation.
This is resolution number 2.
To interfere in the 2020 United States presidential election. As part of this impeachment inquiry, the committee's undertaking the investigation serves subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices and current and former officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to the exercise of the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. 1, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. 2, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. 3, directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael McMulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, Kristen Wells Griffith, Russell T. Vaught, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Breckbull. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of an impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives in the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump has acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of the constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
The question is on the second article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty.
Bullshit, bitch!
Mr. Barrasso. Not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Bozeman.
Oh, there are going to be
guilty.
so many Democrats without
Mr. Braun.
fucking jobs come November.
Not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Burr. Not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Mrs. Capito. Not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Guilty. Mr. Carper. Guilty. Mr. Casey. Guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Not guilty. Ms. Collins. Not guilty. Mr. Coons. Guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Not guilty. Mr. Daines. Not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Guilty. Mr. Durbin. Guilty. Mr. Kinsey. Not guilty. Ms. Ernst. Not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Not guilty. Mr. Gardner. Not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Guilty. Mr. Graham. Not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Not guilty. Ms. Harris. Guilty. Ms. Hassan. Guilty. Mr. Hawley. Not guilty. Mr. Heinrich.
It's like
Guilty.
that old guy with the
Mr.
fucking
Rono.
with the fishing rod.
Guilty.
Almost so
Mr.
close.
Hoven.
You gotta be quicker than
Not
that.
guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Not guilty. Mr. Johnson. Not guilty. Mr. Jones. Guilty. Mr. Kane. Guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Not guilty. Mr. King. Guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Guilty. Mr. Langford. Not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler. Not guilty. Mr. Manchin. Guilty. Mr. Markey. Guilty. Mr. McConnell. Not guilty. Ms. McSally. Not guilty. Mr. Menendez. Guilty. Mr. Merkley. Guilty. Mr. Moran. Not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Not guilty. Mr. Murphy. Guilty. Mrs. Murray. Guilty. Mr. Paul.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Perdue. Not guilty. Mr. Peters. Guilty. Mr. Portman. Not guilty. Mr. Reed. Guilty. Mr. Risch. Not guilty. Mr. Roberts. Not guilty. Mr. Romney. Not guilty. Ms. Rosen.
Oh wait, Mitt Romney went not guilty.
Guilty.
Oh my
Mr.
gosh.
Rounds. Not guilty.
He
Mr.
must be trying
Rubio.
to save his election.
Not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Guilty. Mr. Sass. Not guilty. Mr.
Mitt Romney
Schatz.
went not guilty.
Guilty. Mr. Schumer.
Oh, his Massachusetts constituents
Guilty. Mr.
are
Scott of
probably
Florida.
like, oh my God, we're gonna revote for him.
Not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Not guilty. Ms. Shaheen.
46 to 34. Come on,
Guilty.
boys.
Mr. Shelby.
Not guilty, motherfuckers.
Not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Guilty. Ms. Smith. Guilty. Ms. Stabenow.
Fuck you, Debbie
Guilty.
Stabenow!
Mr.
You
Sullivan.
fucking dumb bitch! You don't fucking
Not
represent
guilty.
me
Mr.
in
Tester.
Michigan, motherfucker!
Guilty. Mr. Thune.
Fuck you, Debbie Stabenow!
Not
you
guilty.
fucking
Mr.
bitch.
Tellis. Not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Not guilty. Mr. Udall.
Fuck
Guilty.
you, Debbie
Mr. Van
Stabenow.
Hollen.
Fuck you
Guilty.
fucking
Mr.
worthless
Warner.
cunt! You do not
Guilty.
fucking
Ms. Warren.
represent Michigan!
Guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Guilty. Mr. Wicker. Not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Guilty. Mr. Young. Not guilty.
President Trump's acquitted!
On this article of
motherfuckers!
impeachment, 47 senators had pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 53 senators had pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that respondent Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the second article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, President of the United States, upon 2 articles of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charges contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby, acquitted of the charges in said articles.
Mr. Justice,
The majority leader is recognized.
I'll send it over to the desk.
Report.
Oh, shit! Oh.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered.
Mr. Justice,
The majority leader is recognized.
before this process fully concludes, I want to very quickly acknowledge a few of the people who helped the Senate fulfill our duty these past weeks. First and foremost, I know my colleagues join me in thanking Chief Justice Roberts for presiding over the Senate trial with a clear head, steady hand, and the forbearance that this rare occasion demands. We know full well that his presence as our presiding officer came in addition to, not instead of, his day job across the street. So the Senate thanks the Chief Justice and his staff who helped him perform this unique role. Like his predecessor, Chief Justice Rehnquist, the Senate will be awarding Chief Justice Roberts the Golden Gavel. To commemorate his time presiding over this body, we typically award this to new senators after about 100 hours in the chair, but I think we can agree the Chief Justice has put in his due and then some. Page is delivering the gavel.
Hey, Nancy Pelosi, you could shove them golden pens up your ass.
Very much.
Of course, there are countless Senate professionals whose efforts were essential. I have more thorough thanks to offer next week to all of those teams. from the Secretary of the Senate's office to the parliamentarian, to the Sergeant at Arms team, and beyond. But there are two more groups I'd like to single out now. First, the two different classes of Senate pages who participated in this trial. Their footwork and cool under pressure literally kept the floor running. Our current class came on board right in the middle of the third presidential impeachment trial in American history and quickly found themselves hand-delivering